Hello and good evening. I'm Melisa Idris. Welcome to Consider This. This is the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. The report on Malaysia's first national baseline assessment on business and human rights has just been released. It shines a spotlight on how corporate actions can directly impact fundamental human rights. Now, as Malaysia pushes for greater economic growth, this report raises urgent questions about whether businesses are doing enough to protect the rights of workers and communities. So joining me on the show is lawyer Edmund Bon, who was the lead consultant for the National Baseline Assessment Report. He's also the representative of Malaysia to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights. Edmund, thank you so much for being on the show with me today.
Thank you.
Let's start big picture. Talk to us how we should understand the role of businesses in protecting human rights. Is it the same thing as ESG compliance?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think we're really excited about this report, mainly because it, for the first time, establishes what Malaysia's baseline is using the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. It has recommendations for the state as well as for businesses, because the state not only must protect human rights, but the non-state actors like companies must respect human rights. So those are the two key pillars, and government commissioned this report based on the three thematic areas, which is governance, labour and environment. So this project took about 2 years. We've got government responses in the report, and it's going to be quite how would you say, progressive if we are able to accept a lot of these recommendations. We also deal with the issue of ESG. So I think one of the gaps we find is that ESG is nice to have. People like to talk about it, but it's not mandatory. And so we have found a lot of companies are not going to do it if it's not mandatory. And one of the recommendations is that we need to look at environmental, social and governance matters more in way of having it into law, having it into policy, and making it more mandatory for companies to follow, as opposed to just this voluntary approach at the moment.
Because voluntary can only get you so far.
Yes.
So the idea of this National Baseline Assessment report is for it to be incorporated into the National Action Plan. Okay.
So the government is coming up with a National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. We have 178 recommendations. Of course, we hope that at least 90% of the recommendations will be accepted. But one of the three pillars of the recommendations would be to mainstream human rights. We've proposed that we have a new Human Rights Act. We propose we have a full Ministry of Human Rights and Justice, because human rights now is placed really nowhere except BIU, which is an agency which requires more staff and more resources. We have also suggested that we need to amend the Constitution to allow for environmental rights, to allow for citizens to actually fight for their rights, going to the courts. We have also suggested that we have a new Modern Slavery Act, so that we can try and deal with this problem of forced labour once and for all. We have also suggested that in our laws we should incorporate FPIC, free, prior, informed consent for the Orang Asli, the Orang Asal, and Anak Negeri Sabah and Sarawak, so that they are not going to be displaced from their lands without adequate compensation, and to really allow for greater diversity for human rights in our country.
Okay. So those are some of the recommendations. Now I want to kind of delve into them more deeply in a little bit. But you mentioned this took a really long time to put together, and part of that was because you really needed to consult all the different stakeholders and also kind of get the response from a government. When you had those numerous stakeholder consultations for the report, what did you hear particularly from businesses? I'm curious.
Yeah, so we took 1 whole year to research, and we had almost 20-30 consultations. We reached about 400 participants, government agencies, businesses, civil society organizations and marginalized groups. So one of the responses that was interesting from businesses was that they want a standard. They want a common standard.
Okay.
But at the moment, the standards are all over the place. What's very encouraging is that Bursa Securities Commission and the Companies Commission has moved ahead, along with Bank Negara, to say, look, you got to incorporate ESG sustainability reporting. But the gap is, what is there to report if it's not really made mandatory? So you can talk about forced labor and modern slavery for a company and say, okay, I don't use forced labor. I just say I don't use forced labor, but how do you do it? How do you make sure you don't use forced labor? So what we have suggested is that you need to do forced labor due diligence. You need to check your supply chain to make sure there's no forced labor. You need to have your human rights audits, and all these things should be part of the reporting. So that's just one example of how we have suggested moving ahead on the issue of forced labor, particularly.
What was the feedback on mandatory human rights due diligence, for instance? I'm wondering, businesses often always cite, it's always about the bottom line, right? It's always about the dollars and cents, the ringgits and cents. So when you think about how businesses approach human rights and the maybe new framework in place that will require more compliance, more mandatory due diligence, how do they respond to that?
So a lot of the bigger companies say they are already doing it, but some of the SMEs are saying it's a bit difficult. So what we have suggested is let's do it in a phased approach. Lead by example, so a lot of our bigger companies have already started it, but globally it's still not enough. And that's why even in Malaysia we see that gap. So there's a lot of lip service being paid, there's a lot of greenwashing, we see whitewashing, and I think we want to hold a lot of these companies more accountable for their actions.
Okay, all right. So when you think about the gaps in kind of corporate human rights practices laid out for us, the report kind of put it into 3 pillars, but also with one special category which cuts across a few other areas like child labor and refugees and
Orang Asli and indigenous extraterritorial obligations, gender
discrimination. Can we talk about that? Lay out for us where you see the most glaring gaps in corporate human rights practices.
So it comes back to the law. So a lot of companies will say government has no Gender Equality Act. So if you ask me to implement policies on DEI, diversity, equality and inclusivity, what is the standard? So I'm just going to try and push different companies.
They follow the law.
Yeah.
Right.
So if there's no law, then the standard I'm going to pull is just a voluntary standard from different organizations somewhere else, or just following a different another company. So we need a common standard. That's why I said that a lot of this needs to be mainstream through law. We need to have amendments to the Constitution. We need to have amendments, for example, and enactment of the Anti-Discrimination Act, the Gender Equality Act that we've all been talking about. We need this type of acts to allow a common standard. So then companies and even government will be able to at least follow these provisions. And even on environmental rights, we still face a lot of problems, especially in marginalized groups, on freedom of information, public participation, freedom of expression. These are issues which really need to be put into our law. And that's why a large part of the recommendations deal with lawmaking.
Right, so harmonizing current laws to uphold human rights.
Incorporating human rights to actually mainstream it. So
it's not the case right now?
At the moment, human rights is only seen through the Suhakam Act, where you say you can consider human rights. And fundamental liberties in the Constitution is interpreted as human rights only if our local law allows it.
Is the term human rights in the Constitution?
No, it's not.
What is it referred to?
Fundamental liberties.
Is that the same thing, legally speaking?
It's not the same thing, because a lot of the judges would say if our local law do not incorporate these principles, I can only use what is in our local law.
Right.
So we have signed up to CEDAW, which is the Women's Anti-Discrimination Convention, CRPD, the disabilities one and the children's one. But yet a lot of these provisions need to be incorporated into our local law, and that's where government is trying to do as much as they can.
Okay.
But we need to speed it up.
Okay, so lawmaking is one area. So and you gave the example of the gender discrimination legal provisions that are still missing. So let's talk about other glaring gaps within the corporate human rights practices. Let's focus on indigenous peoples, indigenous communities. What were the findings within the report?
We don't have a map. So Suhakam has many years ago done a really, really good report, and a lot of recommendations in Suhakam's report has not been adopted. So we have said, let's look at Suhakam's report again, let's put it in. But actually, one point would be to have a map. We don't have a map of indigenous land. So when companies encroach the land or when governments encroach the land, it's very difficult for the indigenous to come to court and then say, look, this is our land. They have to prove so many different things, and burden is on them. It has been really, really difficult for the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal, and we really need, once and for all, as a matter of policy, to do community mapping with government in consultation to say, okay, this is the land area of the indigenous that should not be touched. It should be protected as native land, for example.
So if we had that map, then we can enforce when businesses encroach on the human rights of the indigenous peoples.
Yes, and the indigenous people don't need to go to court. You know how difficult we have found in a lot of the cases that we've seen. They take 10, 20 years to even be able to show that that's their land. The court processes is really against the Orang Asli and the Orang Asal. They have to dig up graves. They have to show that this land was inhabited by their great-grandparents. It's almost impossible because the way of life at that time is not how we are living now. There's no documentation, there's no land title.
Okay, so mapping was one of the recommendations that
Yes,
you...
and FPIC, the Free Prior Informed Consent. So there is a UN convention protecting the rights of indigenous people, and before any company wants to do things on Orang Asli land, we need to ask for their informed consent, free and informed consent. So that principle needs to be legislated, because we're talking about human rights only in terms of policy and practice. But if it's not legislated, then lawyers cannot go to court and say...
Yeah, there's no legal recourse
Exactly.
for that, right?
We can't enforce that in court. We want to enforce that in court. So if we actually recognize the rights of the indigenous people, we need to incorporate that into our laws.
There was also a pillar that focused on environment and how business practices can often encroach on, impede on human rights through exploitation of the environment. Talk to me about that.
So we have suggested you have to have mandatory environmental due diligence.
Mandatory environmental due diligence.
So you can't, before you have a project and you know there's a river running through an Orang Asli kampung, pollute that river. You need to do human rights due diligence on the environment, what's the impact of that project on that river and on the Orang Asli kampung, and then publicize it. At the moment, we have found a lot of gaps in the EIAs, the environmental impact assessments, that are only limited to really, really big projects, but yet we have found that a lot of these reports are ineffective. The consultants are not independent, companies are just ignoring it, there's not enough enforcement, and I think at the moment, when we are talking around the world about ESG, environmental human rights due diligence has become something that's recommended as best practice for a lot of companies. We also need companies to have grievance mechanisms. So we have state mechanisms that are the courts, but courts are sometimes burdened with a lot of work. Companies should allow grievance mechanisms and platforms where people can actually make complaints to the company and say, hey, what are you doing? This is wrong. And the company then deals with those grievances and try and manages it or provides compensation for those who have suffered, rather than just burdening the court system. So we have the state judicial mechanism. We need to have non-state grievance mechanisms. And these remedies are extremely important. As you see, a lot of complaints by NGOs, a lot of complaints by the Orang Asli about how some companies are encroaching on land, even using forced labor. We need to provide a channel for that.
How do we ensure that that grievance mechanism is independent and has oversight?
So the company has to provide it. The company has to make sure it's legitimate. The company has to ensure it's effective and also independent. So some companies have a special committee. Some companies even outsource it to third parties that actually deal with these complaints. As opposed to what's happening now. A lot of times when NGOs, journalists, and groups, marginalized groups, residents complain about a company, what does the company do? The company files a suit against them and says, please stop talking about this case. This is defamation. They go to court, and they will stop the journalist, they will stop the resident, they will stop the orang asli from speaking out. This is called SLAP. It's called strategic litigation against public participation. So we've addressed that as well. It's something quite new around the world, but in Malaysia we are seeing it in forms of defamation suits, SLAPP. So we have said government needs to consider this, look into how we can enact anti-SLAP laws, because the courts are now burdened with many defamation suits against human rights defenders, against environmental human rights defenders, against journalists, because they have raised issues of concern regarding the environment.
One of the things, Edmund, I found really interesting about this report was that it was one of the, maybe the only report that I've seen that included every section, every recommendation had a kind of government policy response.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that. The fact that this report underwent a government review process, probably why it took a long time, but how the government then responded to some of the critical observations that the report made.
So if you look at the report is actually there's a government logo on the report.
Okay,
it's a government adopted report, and we're really happy that we had a collaborative approach with the government. We did the work over a year, and then we collated all the responses and had in-person meeting with government agencies till death. It just went on and on for a year, and the Honourable Minister had decided, no, let's launch it. So for the first time, you have a report not only where we list out the gaps and challenges, but also government response to some of those recommendations and responses. So I think this should be a template of how we should be doing reports in the future. First, we have an independent team from the outside, look at it very independently, but in collaboration with government, and then government coming back and responding to this. So we engage with a whole host of government agencies, including the National Security Council, environment, labor, governance. Everybody came back with written recommendations and in-person meetings. So what I can say with this report is that this is not a one-sided report. This is not a biased report, because you will see that government has responded to this. SSM, Bursa, Securities Commission, I think even Bank Negara have all responded to this report, and we've incorporated all this in the reports.
The response allows a certain level of investment into the outcome of this report. Are you satisfied with the way government has responded to some of the concerns that were raised?
Yes, I think generally for some of the, how would I say, more progressive recommendations, government responds to say let's review it. But for some of the more generic recommendations that have been made around the world already, especially on forced labor and environment, government is saying, yes, I agree with this, I want to move ahead with this. This is already in the pipeline. So things, even on governance, for example, we have a governance chapter. This is probably the first time we have linked governance with human rights. So people say, why is governance a human rights issue? Corruption is a human rights issue because it's an economic, social, cultural rights with you. You take away government funds through corruption, and you are not able to channel it to those people who need it, for example. So there are a lot of recommendations in the governance chapter that talks about procurement, talks about how companies should actually start signing up to ABMS certification before they are able to tender for projects, and how we should be dealing with a lot of our tax incentives, and also to provide support to human rights organizations that actually do really good work supporting the community. How do we give them tax breaks? These are issues that, if Malaysia adopts, would be really progressive, especially when we are going to chair ASEAN next year.
That's right. So that brings me to kind of the wider role of different players in upholding human rights. We are going to be the chair of ASEAN. Are there ways, are there roles for international organizations or trade partners or regional neighbors to play in upholding or upholding a company's duty to be accountable for human rights violations? I'm thinking about the way the US State Department has the trafficking in persons report, and we are on tier 2 now. Is there a role for ASEAN? And if Malaysia is the chair of ASEAN, then should we be thinking about things differently?
Yeah, so Malaysia, through MITI, MATRADE, has adopted a very progressive approach on ESG, sustainability. We want to attract investment, but we need to make sure that whoever comes and does business, or even Malaysian businesses, must do business responsibly. And I think business and human rights here looks at businesses in trying to bring in that new dimension, not just making money out of people to line your own profits. Yes, of course, there will be compliance costs, there will be resources that need to be poured in, but I think we need to be known, Malaysia needs to be known that we are going to do business responsibly, that we're going to do business consistent with human rights. And I think that's a key component of what we want to try and push for as we lead ASEAN next year.
I mean, this is the very first time we've done this national baseline assessment. It's going to feed into the National Action Plan. How do you think we can keep this National Action Plan from being just another beautiful document?
The contestation that's going to happen once the National Action Plan is shared for consultation will actually encourage a bit more alignment. So we do not hear enough of businesses saying what they want or how government should be doing this, except for the usual, when we do training, they'll say, oh, there's these issues of corruption or these cases are environmental problems. But I think the National Action Plan and the National Baseline Assessment allows companies and governments to actually engage and speak to each other. So that's what we're going to try to do at AICHA, at the Malaysian level. What I have actually proposed is that we need to have an annual Malaysian human rights dialogue, or at least an annual Malaysian business and human rights dialogue, where you actually bring together stakeholders, not only government, businesses, trade associations, dialogue partners, to actually start talking about human rights in a way, business and human rights in a way that we are discussing.
Has that been missing from, is that conversation
Yes.
not been happening? So government's having one conversation, business having another conversation.
That's a real problem. So the stakeholder meetings, we have had this concern raised all the time. People are not speaking to each other. They are all working in silos. While government, I think, try their best, MITI, MATRADE, to get people together. But when we're talking about the finer details, the micro details, and trying to socialize the issue, especially human rights, it's still very far off. So I think Malaysia needs a human rights dialogue, institutionalized human rights dialogue, not just with among some stakeholders, but with the wider community. And if we're talking about business and human rights, it has to be the businesses. It has to be our regulatory authorities as well. Because you see, the very strange thing we found is that Bank Negara, Securities Commission, Bursa Malaysia are actually moving much further ahead than our own government agencies on these issues, because they have started with this enhanced sustainability reporting. So we have different standards, as I said. We also have different players, and we need to try and get everybody on the same page. I hope this report will try and level that.
Do you anticipate that the recommendations, the over 100 something recommendations that you put forth, do you anticipate it all being incorporated into the National Action Plan, even the more kind of radical, progressive ones?
I think I have to be realistic. Of course, I would like a lot of them to be in, but I know we're not going to accept a lot, and I know the government may not accept a lot, or they'll study it. But I think there'll also be pushback from companies.
From
so
businesses,
so while we have businesses who have given us views and we have incorporated their concerns here, during the consultation stage of the National Action Plan, which may happen soon, businesses will push back. And perhaps it's going to be a phased approach. So you make certain things voluntary, you socialize it, don't have enforcement, just to get people understanding it. For example, the 17A of MACC, when it came in, there was a period of socialization without enforcement. And then slowly phase towards something that's more mandatory. As well as looking at just bigger companies first, and then slowly phasing it to smaller companies, because some of our SMEs, understandably, are just too small. You just have 5 people, for example. We're not expecting them to really go into all of this at the moment.
Okay, but in terms of the lawmaking, do you see there being kind of legal heft being put behind a National Action Plan?
Yeah, so again, I'm not part of the National Action Plan process. I'm not sure what recommendations are going to be adopted, but Bayu has the human rights portfolio, bahagian al-Iban undang-undang, and it's under the Prime Minister's office. So what I understand is with coming amendments to the Whistleblower Protection Act, I think a new act on freedom of information, these are recommendations that we have made. And also, for example, the SOACAM Act, we said strengthen SOACAM, and this has also come in already. So I think Bayu is on the ball, but of course our recommendations include a lot of different acts that need to be amended. So you have to move away with the Sedition Act, for example, the CMA needs to be amended, Printing Presses Publications Act. So that whole legislative reform part, I hope this government will keep to its promise to look at all these laws.
Thank you so much for being on the show,
Thank you
and thank you for sharing your work with us. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. I'm Melisa Idris, signing off the evening. Thank you so much for watching. Good night.